Hello, my name is David Travis, and in this video I'm going to answer 10 questions about user experience. Those 10 questions were posed by people in a Facebook group that I run, and that's for people that are taking one of my Udemy classes. So if you're taking one of my Udemy classes, I'll put the link below, and please sign up and join the Facebook group. It's a great community. We answer lots of questions every day to do with people in user experience. Let's go through those 10 questions now. So first of all, the first one I'm going to pick, and I've chosen these because people posed the questions on the Facebook group and each of them got upvoted by other people. So these are the top 10 questions that had the most votes. And the first one, it was the standout winner, it had 7 votes, was from Macarena Araneda. I hope I've pronounced your name properly, Macarena. And she asked, how would you recommend testing and measuring the performance of a site's main navigation, both as a standalone or in comparison to a proposed new variation? I think this is an important question because often, users will often say, I can't find stuff with this particular website. So like navigation is a key thing. And certainly clients obviously want to optimize the navigation of the websites that they have. So working out how to test your navigation, rather than just people saying, well, I kind of like it or it seems intuitive to me, makes a lot of sense. How do you go about doing it? Well, the method that I've used in the past and that I would recommend here is a technique called a closed card sort. And that closed card sort, what you do with it is you present a kind of a skeleton-based version of your navigation structure, and then you ask people to find certain things in the system based on the tasks you want them to carry out. In fact, let me dive into some work that I did a little while back for a client that wanted to do exactly this, and I'll show you the kind of thing that we did and the way the results looked. So in this presentation, I've obviously changed the name I've removed the name of the client so that you don't know who it's for, but I can tell you that they were in the fintech sector, and the purpose of this was to give people at the team, at the client that were working on the intranet, some advice on how to test out or work out whether their navigation system is any good. We did a closed card sort, and this is kind of a report card, a summary of what the results were. So you can see the tasks we asked people to do, their success rates, and what I gave an overall rating to. Let me zip through this presentation. So basically, we gave people a scaled down version of the intranet. So it was like a skeleton version of just the navigation. Imagine the left-hand nav with nothing else at all, and people needed to click within that to work out where they would answer these particular tasks. So we had tasks like find an expenses claim form. The way we gave that to the participant was find an expenses claim form for one night's accommodation, and then they had to go through this skeleton-based navigation system and tell us where they would find it. There's a single report that I produced for each task. This is kind of a quick summary of that. Let's jump into one of those specific ones. So this is for find an expenses claim form. And you can see that what I've measured here at the top, this is how to work out whether or not the navigation system is any good, is a success rate, and that success rate is defined as the percentage of people who chose the correct answer. There were quite a large sample in this. We had about over 200 people. It was run as an online study, so we can accurately calculate things like success rate. The error bar here shows plus or minus I think it's plus or minus 2 standard deviations, I think. I also broke that down into a detailed breakdown. So some people were directly successful. By that I mean they went straight to the correct answer. Some people need to backtrack. I call that an indirect success. And then there were people that obviously failed the task. And the third one on the right hand side, you can see here, I've labelled it directness. That was the people who didn't backtrack. We can also measure the time taken. Now you can do that and compare it with competitor or alternative systems as well. Give people the same tasks, see which one they perform best on. And that kind of, I call this kind of thing skinny data. And what we're getting with skinny data is we're getting a measure, an estimate of usability. And it's a great way for proving that your intranet or your navigation system is better than the previous one It's less good for finding out why your existing system doesn't work. If you want to find out the answer to that question, then instead you're going to need to do something which collects kind of what I call fat data. By that I mean you're going to need to collect observations or stories from people using the system to try and find out where they struggle. But I do believe that answers that particular question, Macarena. Nathan Smith, he asks, are there any changes or trends that you see for UI, UX and product designer roles in the coming year? I'm not very good at actually predicting the future, but let me give you an idea of where I think it's gone in the past and where it might be headed now. And I would say that what I've noticed is that UI and UX roles are becoming more specialised. So back in the day, when I first embarked on this career, you were kind of expected to be a team of one. So you would do the user research, you would do the prototyping and the design, you would do the testing, you would write the copy. You kind of did a bit of everything. And over the last 5 years or so, things are becoming more and more specialised, at least in organisations that have got some maturity in the field. And I'll only see that increasing. So at the moment, if you call yourself a UX designer or a UXer, I think you need to start specifying, well, what do you mean by that? What exactly is in scope for you and what's not? So do you do content design? Do you do user research? Or do you do prototypes and front-end coding? What precisely is your role? So think more about specialising. I think another thing that's changing over time is that we've now got a stronger voice within the teams that we work within. Everybody now realises that this kind of thing matters, which means that rather than it being dismissed as, well, it would be nice to help users, but that we can't do that in the first release, what's going to happen, or what I see happening increasingly, is that becomes the main driver, the main decision in making things happen. I also think that there'll be more work on voice-based user interfaces. That's not an area of expertise of mine, but certainly it's something which I only see increasing, and it's something that's on my roadmap to learn more about over the next 6 months or so. And I also see it being more embedded in physical products as well. So the idea that previously digital products were things that existed on screens like this or on mobile phones, well, we're clearly seeing digital interfaces in a range of things, from fridge freezers through to car dashboards. And so I think someone that's got an understanding of that broader range of products and product design generally will thrive in that new world. So the next question I've got here is from Jonathan Melwish, or Melwish, I hope I pronounced your name properly, Jonathan. And he asks, how do you recommend designing, prototyping and testing UX when the user needs are primarily emotional? I'm developing an app to help people have better, deeper and more authentic conversations with each other, which mainly means nurturing self-acceptance to overcome social anxiety. Sounds like an important application you're developing, Jonathan. The problem I have is Don Norman wrote a whole book about designing for emotional experiences, and his kind of conclusion was that it was important, but he wasn't entirely sure how you go about doing it, other than the fact that it matters. What I think you could do, for example, if we take an analogy, let's think about the world of movies. So film directors, take Steven Spielberg, for example, know how to stir emotions in people as a way of telling a story. They kind of know certain rules or certain patterns that you could follow that work in movies. We just don't know what those patterns are yet in user interfaces or user experiences. You can use a user journey map to map out the highs and lows of the current experience based on what people are saying about it, but it's difficult to reverse engineer that and say, if we did this instead, we would get a peak in the experience. It's kind of something that you can only get through testing after you've come out with the design. You can make some guesses, but that's what they are. They are guesses. The other difference is between a user experience and a movie is that with a movie, we know there's one route through. You know, you start at the beginning, you have 3 acts, you end up at the end, and you've created emotions during that process. You are leading the user or the viewer by the hand. We can't do that with digital experiences yet. And the reason is because people can take different routes through it. And I thought about, when I was thinking about this question, it occurred to me that as another analogy, forget the fact that it's an app that you're designing. And imagine that this was a real world meeting. Let's say you had a group of people together and you wanted them to have an authentic, collaborative, helpful session. How would you do that? Well, there could be people that don't want to engage like that, and it almost doesn't matter what you do, you're stuck. But in order to create the best possible context for that, I reckon you would probably have some kind of facilitator who would set ground rules, a facilitator that would encourage the right kind of conversation and discourage the wrong kind of conversation. And it occurred to me that perhaps that's something that you could use in your own app, that you can have a facilitator that plays that role, that helps people have the kind of conversations that you want people to have. It's not a great answer, but it's the best I can do. Next up, we have Mora de Dominicis Betler, and she asks, what happens when they fire the UX designer and just let the engineer do it? Well, I've been on many projects where that's happened. Well, the first thing I'd say is it depends on the engineer, because some engineers that I've worked with are actually very good designers and they understand the importance of research. So I think the general principle is anyone can design great user experiences so long as they follow an appropriate process. And that process almost always begins with some kind of research to understand a user needs, some kind of way of characterizing the research that you've discovered in terms of, say, personas, user journey maps, scenarios. They're kind of receptacles for the insights that you've put together. And then you use those insights to start coming up with designs that you put in front of users, that you test. And that, if you're following that process, well, there's no reason why an engineer can't be as good as a dedicated user experience person. The alternative is if that's happened to you on a project, it's not all bad, because what will happen if somebody doesn't follow that process is there'll be a disaster at some point, that they'll be working on a project, they won't follow the process, they won't do user research, they'll come up with something that they think is great and that fails. And when that happens, typically that's when clients begin their journey in terms of user experience. So they start getting a bit more mature, they realise that there's a whole field dedicated to this, and then they get people involved. So if you've got a particularly clueless person doing design on a project that you're thinking of, just wait, and eventually it will come to haunt the client and they'll want your help. Another question here from David Morava. What makes a great UX designer? Is it a matter of time, or is it ultimately about talent? Well, I think there's really one key aspect of what makes a great UX designer, and that is to not have ego about your designs. So you get two types of designer. You get designers that think they know best, and they're going to come up with a design and it's going to work for users. Users just don't know that yet. And you get another class of designers that are still confident. It's not that they don't feel confident in their answers. They just appreciate that they can't put themselves wholeheartedly in the shoes of users. And so their approach instead is to make sure that they use a process where the user's voice is heard. So they base decisions on what works best for users rather than on fashion. On top of that, I'd also add what makes a good UX designer is knowing how to prototype. So it's no good if you can just create a great looking mock-up in Photoshop. Design is all about learning, and that means we need to come up with designs that we can put in front of users and that we can test and refine. And if you can create your own prototypes as a designer, then that's a definite thumbs up. And the next thing I'd add as well is another thing that I think makes a great UX designer is realizing that you need to explore many, many alternatives early on in design. So rather than just coming up with different versions of a website for an app that you're coming up with, instead think of completely different ways of meeting that user need. a range of different ideas that you can then put in front of users and see if they work. Kathleen Benny Frank, she asks, I haven't really seen this, but what might a general succession plan look like for a UX designer? And I'm going to combine that with a question from Kishore Kankipati, who asks, how do you get from a designer to a strategizer? What are the steps to take? What kind of attitude do you require? I think they're a similar kind of question. On this one, let me tell you about my own experience. So I think inevitably when you enter the field, you provide tactical support to your clients. So you're hired either as an employee or as an external consultant to do things like create user interfaces, to run usability tests, to go out and understand users and do some user research. You're hired to do tactical things. And I think you need to get good, first of all, at those tactical things and do a whole range of it. I know I said earlier about being a specialist, but this is the time early on in your career when you also want to get a wide range of all of the things that you could do so that you know what works and what doesn't work. And that's because the difference between a novice and an expert is you have a range of patterns in your head, situations that you know worked in the past. Those patterns both apply to design and research, but they also apply to some of the teams you're with. So, for example, I've worked with some teams that are very antagonistic to user research, and I know what to do in that situation because I've learned from my mistakes. I've also worked with other teams that are very sophisticated in the field, and I know how to adjust my practice so that I can work with them. But that only comes by actually doing it. And I'd say it's like a minimum, really, of 3 to 5 years worth of tactical experience that you need before you can start doing good strategic work. The other thing I'd recommend is that you learn how Scrum works so that you know how to fit with the current trend of the way software is designed. And a third way would be to publish thought articles, so blog posts describing the way that you've seen things work, your expectations on the way things are going, case studies, a bit like a live portfolio, but something that positions you as a thought leader. I think all of those things will help you move up the ladder from doing the tactical work initially through to being able to provide a more strategic view and tell the client what kinds of research they should be doing. A question here from Macarena Aranida. I think this is her second question, but her questions were so popular. How can one transition from freelance work to a full-time UX researcher position? I find that more and more companies are hiring a single researcher at a senior level, which makes it difficult to break into. Well, it's a real problem these days, I think. And that's because UX is seen as a core competency. So nearly every organisation will have someone that kind of does this kind of research, at least nominally. They'll have them labelled. The question is, how do you break into that when in the past, because they didn't have these roles, it was easier to get recruited for, whereas these days it's a bit harder. Well, if you're currently an employee, if you're currently a contractor in the company and you want to become an employee, I would do your best work. Become indispensable to that particular client and show them how much value you add, which will encourage them then to think of you as a full-time person. And the other technique is to charge more money. And if it's cheaper for them to employ you than it is to hire you as a consultant, then they'll obviously do that. If you're in a very long-term contract with the client and they've not asked you to become an employee yet, there's probably a couple of reasons, but the main one will be that it's cheaper for them to hire you as a consultant than it is to employ you full-time. There could be other reasons to do with the particular client themselves, of course. But generally, that would be another approach. And at least with that particular method, if they still won't hire you as an employee, you still get more money than the employees. So it's not all bad news. A question here from Valentine Lieber. Does it make sense to work remotely as a UX designer? And I think the answer is generally no. It doesn't make sense to work remotely. I think there are a few reasons for this. One is that we live in a world, whether you like it or not, which is Scrum based for development of projects and particularly digital products. And with Scrum, work happens in teams. The best teams are multidisciplinary and they're co-located. So if you're not part of that team, or you're not able to be part of the co-located team, then you're not going to be included in discussions. Lots of design decisions happen during the day, micro decisions, which mount up. And if you're not there to answer those design decisions, someone else will make them. They won't get on the phone, or they won't Skype with you in order to discuss this. The big decisions they may do, but lots of the small decisions they'll make on their own because you're just not there for them to ask. And the consequence of that is all of those small decisions mount up into big decisions which change the product itself. And when the product fails, you'll take the can because you were meant to be looking at the design or controlling the design. If for some reason you have to work remotely, I don't know, maybe you're based in a very remote location, it's not easy for you to move or whatever, what I would do is work on more waterfall style projects where design's kind of done up front. It's anathema really to good user experience, but there are still organizations that do this, so you could work with them instead, and they would expect the design to be done and then it can be handed over. It's not ideal, but it might help meet your needs. And the other approach is to work in organizations with a low user experience maturity. What I mean by that is organizations that haven't quite got the importance of user experience yet, and as a consequence they're not going to be turning to you for answers to their questions every day. They might expect a big design up front, so that might work. Final question comes from Lynn Park. She argues, or she asks, voice interactions becoming more popular. I find it fascinating to be able to turn my TV heating and lights on by just saying it, as long as I say it correctly. I'm interested to know how UX has been or is being affected by this new technology that's been out for a few years. I'm not sure how you would do user research on this functionality. How do people know what to say? What should be considered since you can't see the usual visual affordances or design guidelines? Is there a design principle behind this? Lynn, the answer is yes. I mentioned earlier I'm not an expert on voice, but as in most of my life, I've got on by finding people who are knowledgeable about things. And my colleague Philip Hodgson actually knows voice inside and out. He did his PhD in speech, and he has written a couple of articles at the User Focus website. One was published in May, and the next one's due to be published later on in June. If you head over to the User Focus website on the first Monday in June, when his article goes live, you'll learn more than you could possibly want to learn about this area, about applying voice interfaces. It's a brilliant question. So they were my 10 questions about user experience. I hope your question was there. If you're in the Facebook group and your question wasn't answered, post it as a separate topic and I'll make sure that I provide some kind of text answer to it instead. But thanks for listening, and see you back in the Facebook group.